But subsequent kings, pharaohs in Egypt, didn't recognize all the good things that their patriarch Joseph has done for the Egyptians. They begin to enslave the Jews, and they make them work hard in the land of Egypt as slaves. And the Jewish people cry out to God for help. And God commissioned Moses to come to deliver the people. So when Moses went to the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to ask for the people to be released so that they can go to a promised land in Canaan. Well, the Pharaoh refused. So the king of Egypt were in many ways judged by God. God actually sent 10 plagues to them. The last plague was that God actually killed the firstborn of every Egyptian. At the end of the 10 punishment, Pharaoh allowed the Jewish people to get out from Egypt. And they were supposed to enter the promised land, this place called Canaan, 40 years ago. But when the people heard that there were giants living in Canaan, they got frightened. And they didn't have the faith, they could not trust God to help them, overcome all these inhabitants in Canaan. And because of their disobedience, God punished the nation of Israel. He let them go round and round and round in the wilderness for 40 years. Until every fighting man that is 20 years and above died. And a new generation came up. And Joshua was asked to lead this new generation. So if you read Joshua chapter 3, chapter 4, you begin to see that God actually performed a miracle. After 40 years of wandering around in the desert, God got the new generation and he parted the Jordan River. The Jordan River was flooded at the time. It was almost impossible for anyone to cross to the other side into the promised land. But God opened up a way for them to go over. When the priests stepped into the river Jordan, suddenly God stopped the water from flowing upstream 25 miles away. And the people could cross. 1.5 to 2 million people crossed the river. And they came into this place here called Gilgal. Gilgal was only about 2 miles from this very big fortified city of Jericho, where there is a stronghold of these Canaanites living there, the enemies of Israel. So the people were all excited. We read, can we, you have the picture of them crossing the river Jordan. And the people were excited. They were really, really feeling very, very high, emotionally. We read in Joshua 4, verse 14, that day, when God performed that miracle, God exalted Joshua to be a great leader in the eyes of the Israelites. And for the rest of his life, the people revered Joshua as much as they had revered Moses. The people were feeling high. For the first time, after 40 years of wandering round and round, they finally have a purpose, they finally have a goal to go into the land of Canaan and possess it. A land that God has promised that it will be flowing with milk and honey. It's something that many of you feel too, especially from Pastor Rhoda. For many years she's been praying, God, let us have a good place to worship for the Filipino community. Let us have something that is central, near to Orchard Road, so that we can invite more friends to come. And now it has happened. Are you excited? This is a new destiny, a new chapter for all of you. And then at the same time, while the people of Israel, they were excited, the enemies, the Canaanites, they were paralyzed with fear. We read in verse 1, when all the Amorite kings west of the river Jordan and all the Canaanite kings who live along the Mediterranean coast heard how God has dried up the river Jordan so that the people of Israel could cross. When they saw what God did, they lost heart and they were paralyzed with fear because of them. Now, the inhabitants of Canaan, the enemies of Israel, begin to realize that, hey, there is a powerful God who has helped these people to cross over. And they're going to take over our territory. And they were frightened, they were paralyzed with fear. So you have the people of Israel feeling very high and the enemies feeling very low. So in that condition, the normal situation would be for Joshua to say, okay, guys, get ready. We are going to conquer the land right now because the people are demoralized. We are feeling very strong and God is with us as charge. That would be the natural intention, right? But hear what God said in verse 2. God didn't say, gather the people together, prepare to fight. But God told Joshua, get the knives ready, okay? And circumcise this second generation of Israel. And Joshua made knives and he circumcised the entire male population of Israel. It's very different, sometimes the ways of God and our ways. What God was saying to the people is that before you go out to conquer the land, you need to consecrate yourself and give yourself to me. You see, for 40 years, when the people were wandering around in the desert, none of those male population that were born in the wilderness were circumcised. And God said to the people, I want all the males to be circumcised. From baby, 7 days old, all the way to the oldest male. The oldest male will be about 59 years old. Okay, those 20 years and above, all the males all died in the desert. They were the fighting men. From 19 years old onward, with 40 years, so they're about 59 years old, right? Am I right? 40 yeah. 59 years old. These were the people who were not circumcised before. Now, if you were Joshua, how would you feel? You say, God, well, I get it. You want us to be circumcised once again to be your people. But if you wanted to do that, you should have done it before we crossed the river. Because when we were on the other side of the river, we have already conquered all the land there. We were safe from our enemies. Now we cross over to this side. We are in enemy's territory. The city of Jericho, a big stronghold of the enemies, just 2 miles away. And if we get all our male population to snip, then what will happen? They are going to have, you all know what circumcision is, right? Yeah. I don't have to elaborate on that one. No. So if they get snip, and most of them, they would have wounds that take about at least 3 to 4 days to heal. And during that period of time, while the wounds are healing, it's very hard for the male warriors to fight any enemy. It will be painful for them to move around. And Joshua will be saying, God, do you know that if we circumcise everyone, we will become vulnerable, like sitting ducks for our enemies if they attack us. We will not be able to fight with our full capacity. But God said to Joshua, circumcise the people. And the whole population, the whole camp has to settle down, pause for the time being, and get themselves circumcised. They have to exercise faith to believe that God can protect them. They have to believe that God will keep them safe from the enemy's attack while they are recovering from the wounds. So consecration always requires faith and makes us vulnerable. It is also painful in some ways. But if we want to be totally used by God subsequently, first of all, we need to consecrate ourselves to Him. And that also means taking the step of faith. I remember many years back, in about year 2000, our church was really growing very fast. I was having a very good time ministering. I was having a very cozy job where I don't actually work very hard. But, the business was doing well, and I really had a good pay and a very easy job. Everyone wants to fight to get that job. But I felt convicted by God that I ought to retire at that point. At the age of 48, I should retire and go on into a new, venture with God. So I remember that I have to take a step of faith. Give up a good pay and not knowing what God is leading me to. So that's what I did. Now looking back, something about 18, 19 years later, I'm so glad that I did that. Because I learned something more about God and I become more useful to God. You see, consecration needs faith and it's painful. So the people actually were willing to be vulnerable. That's the first thing about circumcising the people. The people were willing to be vulnerable. The second thing we begin to realize is that while the people were being circumcised, actually God renewed His covenant with Israel. Circumcision was a very important part, an important symbol of God's covenant with His people. When God blessed Abraham in Genesis 17, and He said, Abraham, I'm going to make a covenant, an agreement with you. You are going to be my people, I'm going to be your God. And all the generations thereafter will be my people. I'm going to bless them. But as a sign of this covenant, you must circumcise every male in your household, including servants and slaves. Okay? You must cut off the flesh of their foreskin as a sign of covenant between you and me. Circumcision was a symbol of God's covenant with the nation of Israel. So what happened was that when the people disobeyed God, when they were wandering around for 39 years, 40 years in the desert, the male being born during that period of time were not circumcised because God suspended the covenantal relationship with the people because of their disobedience. Now, when the people obeyed God and God themselves circumcised, the Lord said, I am now renewing my covenant with you. It's so important, friends, to be God's people. How many of you want to be the people of God? Put up your hands. All of you want to be, right? Some of you may not have a personal relationship with Jesus as yet. Today, instead of getting ourselves circumcised in the foreskin, God wants to circumcise all of us in our heart. So when we actually believe in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, then Jesus will come into our lives and He will circumcise our heart and remove all the bad things inside. Circumcision is essentially saying that I'm cutting off the bad things of the past and I'm giving you a new life altogether. So that's what it means. And we need to be circumcised spiritually. And the only way that we can do that is when we ask Jesus to come into our heart and His Spirit, change us from within, circumcise our heart. Okay. So God renewed His covenant with the people of Israel during that period. And in verse 9, we see something else that happened at Gilgal. God took away the sin and the shame. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I've rolled away the shame of your slavery in Egypt. So that place has been called Gilgal. Gilgal, the Hebrew word means roll away. So that place has been called Gilgal since to this day. I have today removed the shame of your slavery in Egypt. What does that mean? When the people of Israel disobeyed God, they begin to wander 40 years in the desert. You know what the enemy saw it as? Look at these people. Their God was powerful, yes, got them out from Egypt, parted the Red Sea for them, and got them into, part of the wilderness. But their God wasn't powerful enough to bring them into the promised land. So for 40 years, look at these poor Jews. They wander round and round in the desert, having no aim, having no purpose, and their God didn't know what to do with them. And the enemies mock and laugh at Israel. When this poor Israel was wandering for 40 years. That day, God said, because you obeyed me by getting yourself circumcised, because you consecrated yourself to me, I'm going to do this. I'm going to remove your shame. I'm going to remove your guilt. I'm going to remove all that you are sick inside. I'm going to make you whole so that you are strong and you are fit to go out to take the land. When I read this, I can think of some of us here today. We had hard lives. We may have tough bosses. Very, very nasty bosses, some of you have. Some of you in the past could have done certain things that you are shameful of today. Some of you felt that you have not been a good mom, not a good dad, not a good wife, not a good husband. Some of you felt that you're not made enough to help your family in Philippines. And there's a lot of guilt and shame in your heart. When you consecrate yourself to God, He's saying to you today, I am going to remove that shame, that guilt, that sadness in your heart. And I'm going to make you whole. But in order for you to do that, you need to give yourself totally to God. Surrender all that you have to God and ask Him to change you. Afterward, I'll be asking Pastor Rhoda to help us to do that. You know, at the point of consecration, God renewed His covenant with His people, and God took away their shame, their guilt, and healed them. Now, because the people consecrate themselves to God, blessings flow almost immediately. Right? I think the first one is that God took away their sin and shame. But there are three other blessings that I want to talk about when the people consecrate themselves to God. The first one was that Israel could celebrate the Passover once again. Verse 10, it says that while the people, the Israelites, were camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, they celebrated Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the first month. It may not seem significant to us today. I want you to understand something. It is a big, big blessing for the nation of Israel. You see, before that, the nation of Israel had only celebrated the Passover 2 times. The first time was when they were in Egypt. Can you show the picture of yeah, okay. You see, when they were in Egypt, when Pharaoh did not let the people go, God did a final judgment on the Egyptians. He said, if you don't let the people go, I am going to kill every firstborn in every household of the Egyptians. And then God told Moses, tell the people of Israel, you must prepare a lamb, okay? Each family must have a lamb, kill that lamb, and then use the blood to put on the door frame of your house. And after that, you are to eat, you can roast the lamb and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And this will be a Passover meal for you. Why? Because tonight, I'm going to come. I'm going to sweep right through the whole land of Egypt. And whenever I see blood on the doorframe, I will pass over you. But for those homes that do not have blood on the doorframe, I will go in, I will kill the firstborn male of every household. So the Jewish people need to act in faith. They have to kill a lamb, put the blood on the doorframe, and sit in the house and wait for God to pass over them. And it became a symbol of God's grace to the people of Israel and a judgment to their enemies. Okay? Because that night when God passed through, He killed every firstborn male of the Egyptians. And Scripture said there was no families in Egypt that did not have one death in the house. That was a judgment of God. And in Exodus 12, verse 25 and 27, we see this significance. God said to the people, He said, when you enter the promised land, okay, you will continue to observe this ceremony, this Passover feast. Then when your children will ask, what is this? What does this ceremony mean? And you'll reply, this is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord. For He passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, and though He struck the Egyptians, He spared our families. To the Jews, the Passover was a very important event for them to understand that God has been good to them and God has been bad to the enemies. But the nation of Israel only celebrated it 2 times before. One in Egypt, and then the year after they went out of Egypt, they actually celebrated the Passover at Mount Sinai. After that, because of their disobedience, they never celebrated it anymore. But this time, because they consecrated themselves at Gilgal by circumcising the male, God said, because now you are my people, because you are now circumcised, you can celebrate this Passover. It's like for all of you Filipinos, God said you can celebrate Christmas once again. Imagine you never celebrate Christmas for 39 years, 40 years. Now you can celebrate Christmas again. What a joy, right? So this is what happened. The first blessing is that the people were able to identify themselves with God and say, yes, I am God's people. And I can celebrate what God has done for me. And I can also have this faith to believe that God is going to judge my enemy. So that is the first blessing. Now the second blessing is that, in verse 11 and verse 12, Israel enjoyed Canaan's first fruits. The very next day, after they had the Passover feast, they begin to eat the unleavened bread and roasted grain harvested from the land. Before that, they always receive only manna. They don't have any other food to eat. But after they got themselves circumcised, the very next day, they were able to eat the unleavened bread and the roasted grain that were harvested in the promised land. God was so good. He let the people cross over to River Jordan just during the harvest time, so that the people were able to enjoy the harvest that the previous Canaanites had planted the crops. God said to the people, because you are my people, I'm going to give you a land that you're going to go in and you're going to enjoy, the food, the fruits, the grains that you have not planted. And you're going to drink from water, from wells that you have not dug. And you're going to have milk and honey that others have cultivated. That is a blessing of God when we consecrate ourselves to Him. Abundance will flow. I want to share with you this very important principle. God loves each one of us. And He has blessings for all of us. We may not realize it, but oftentimes we forfeit the blessings of God because we live lives that are not pleasing to God. And because of our sin, because of our negativity, we choke the channel whereby God's blessing can flow into our hearts. And consecration means that we actually unplug, we unclog this chokage so that we can come in, so the blessings of God can come into our lives. I want to share with you this very important principle. When we are obedient to God, when we walk in righteousness before God, the Lord will always take care of us. But if we live lives that are not honorable, then the sin, in that sense, choke the channels from which blessings flow into our lives. You understand what I'm saying? God wants to give us blessings. And this is where we need today to unclog, to unblock, to clear the passageway for God to flow all that He has, the good things He has for us. Do you want God's blessing? Yes. All of us want God's blessing. And all we need to do is surrender ourselves to Him. And blessings, by the way, need not be material blessings. It could be a peace that you have that you never had before. It could be a sense of joy that you don't understand. It can be friends. It can be good relationship. It could be this sense that you know, this well-being that the shalom peace that comes into your heart. These are the blessings of God. I thought David, would you mind standing up? You know, my friend here, David, in my cell group. This man, you can sit down now. You know, this man, David, he had stage 4 cancer, lung cancer. Okay, the spread from his prostate to his lungs and over his body. He wasn't a Christian then. Then he came to our church on Christmas Day. And he received Christ, and Pastor John Cole prayed for him. And then when he went out to see the doctor a month later, the doctor did blood tests and CT scan and found that there's no trace of cancer anymore in his body. I mean, it is a miracle that God has done for him. The doctor would never understand how, for a stage 4 cancer patient with different parts of your organs being infected, with cancer, that suddenly, your whole blood, your whole body, your whole blood count seems to be totally free from cancer cells. And David and Rose has been growing so much in their faith, in their walk with God. They've been sharing the gospel with various ones. And I want to say to all of us, we have a good God who loves us deeply. And His desire has always been that we walk with Him, that He will bless us and strengthen us. Think of that. Now I want to look at the last one on the blessing of consecration. Because Israel committed themselves totally to God, they were able to defeat many of their enemies in the promised land. We read near to the last book, the last chapter of Joshua. Joshua said to the people after many years, he said this as he reflects on what God has done. He said, the Lord has driven out great and powerful nations for you. Who did all the conquests, who drove out all the enemies is God, right? And no one has been able to defeat you. Each one of you, look at verse 10, each one of you will put to flight 1,000 of the enemies. One of you can chase 1,000 enemies. Why? Because the Lord your God fights for you, just as He promised. The people were victorious because they walked upright with God in the lives of Joshua. And I want to say to all of us here, God will fight your battle. God will help you if you allow Him to. And He will do that when we start from the point of consecration. So I want to basically summarize the 3 blessings of consecration. The people were able to celebrate the Passover. How? God renewed His covenant with the people. Now the people are back into communion with God. 2, the people were able to eat the first fruit in Canaan that day. And that was the fulfillment of God's promise to the people. I'm going to bring you into land where you're going to eat things that you have not worked for because I'm blessing you. And the third thing is that, the third blessing is that the people were able to defeat their enemies. Why? Because God was fighting for them. I want you to think of it, what I've just shared. And there are 3 parts of a personal application. The first is today. Before you go out to share with your friends, to invite them to church on Sunday, before you reach out and care for one another, let's consecrate ourselves for God's new work. Okay? This is a new work that God is doing. Before we go out, first of all, let's consecrate ourselves to God. And the second thing is, for some of you, you feel guilty, you feel shameful, you feel inferior, you feel weak inside. Allow God to take away your sin and your shame. God can heal you internally. Whatever heart issues or problems you have. And then, once you're healed, once you've consecrated yourself to God, let's go out and reach out to others. Those of your friends who are lost. Some of your friends, who you know are good people, but they have not known Jesus yet as personal Lord and Savior. Share the gospel with them. I want to say to some of you here that you may also attend church, but if you have not known Jesus personally as your Lord and Savior, you can do so today. I want to maybe get the worship team to come up first. Let's sing this song, Let Your Glory Fall. And then after that, I ask Pastor Rhoda to lead us into a time of consecration. And then for those of you who have yet to know Jesus as Lord and Savior, that she too would also bring you to that place where you have a new relationship with God. Okay? Thank you. Yeah. Let's
shall we consecrate and use this moment as a consecration as we offer our lives and